A true democracy in talk radio. Of, for, and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Hi, I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm a national Democratic strategist, columnist for The Messenger in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for news radio station KNX in Los Angeles. You can read my columns in The Messenger at muckrack.com/Brad Bannon/articles. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. Mondays on Deadline DC, I talk to the people and players behind the politics and policies that drive our great nation forward. Today, we have a great bunch of guests, including our intrepid executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, who keeps the show online, and me on time, which is not an easy thing to do. Today on the show, we have two great guests. Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of Politicus.com, joins us to discuss the not-so-great Republican debate. Then in the second half hour, Hope Fry, the founder of Project Lifeline, joins us to discuss the inhumane treatment of immigrants at the Mexican border. Before we get to our first guest, though, we're going to listen to Ali Velshi on MSNBC talking about the GOP candidate's pledge of support for Donald Trump.
You all signed a pledge to support the eventual Republican nominee. If former President Trump is convicted in a court of law, would you still support him as your party's choice? Please raise your hand if you would.
Vivek Ramaswamy's hand went up like fast as it absolutely could. It was interesting to watch. We'll probably play it again. Ron DeSantis sort of checking around to see who else was raising their hand and then sort of putting his hand up about halfway. This is the state of the presidential campaign of the party of Abraham Lincoln in a world where the Republican frontrunner has been indicted 4 times this year and faces 91 felony counts. In a world where the Republican frontrunner stands accused of racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction, and charges related to the continued effort and the coordinated effort to overturn a presidential election, thus ending the American small d democratic experiment. Abraham Lincoln went to war to keep this nation together, but for most of the Republicans on that stage last night, a full-throated condemnation of Donald Trump remains too much.
That was Ali Velshi, MSNBC, talking about the support of the GOP candidates last week at the big debate for their disgraced president, Donald Trump. Watching the first GOP national debate was a lot like going to a Bruce Springsteen concert and having to settle for watching the E Street Band because Boston was somewhere doing a solo gig. Our guest in this half hour is Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. She's here to talk about the Republican presidential race after their not-so-great debate last week. Sarah, welcome back to Deadline DC. Well, it's great to have you here. Well, let's start. One of the things I chuckled at in that clip was it was true when they asked the candidates whether they'd vote for Donald Trump if he's the nominee. Ron DeSantis, before raising his hand, looked around to see what everybody else was doing, which I think is a telling point about his candidacy. But, was last week just sideshow because the big dog wasn't there. Donald Trump was doing his thing with Tucker Carlson on a platform called X, formerly known as Twitter. Uh, was it worth watching without the big guy there? Yeah, yeah. And the worst part of it, when you talk about Ashley Hutchinson and Chris Christie, I think it's interesting that the two candidates who were, willing to criticize Trump were both former U.S. attorneys, which I think is an interesting, not so coincidence. And every time Hutchinson or Christie spoke up against Trump's crimes, trying to steal the election, they were booed. And in my column in the Messenger said it was like they were volunteers from the Women's Temperance Union walking into a bar and trying to stop people from drinking. They were constantly booed anytime they made any kind of mention of criticism of Trump, which is a sad commentary on Republican primary voters. Let's say, MSNBC just released a poll that showed Trump's lead slump for a few points after the debate. Do you think he'll show up at the next one on September 27th, which is a little less than a month from now? Yeah, okay. Well, I guess that means he's going to go on with Tucker Carlson again. I don't know how many people listen to that exchange. I know about 13.5 million watched the Republican debate. Uh, Let me ask you one question. Let me ask you another question about Trump while on the subject. Do you think he's going to be the Republican nominee? We can only hope. Sarah, we have to come to a brief stop here because we have to let out our radio listeners for a couple of minutes. But I'll be continuing the interview with Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. We come back from this very quick break.
If you came across someone struggling with hunger, how would you recognize them? By their clothes, their age, the way they...
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. She is here today to discuss the Republican presidential race and the great debate. Sarah, let me ask you to comment on some of the individual candidates. First, there is Ron DeSantis, who used to be, and maybe still is marginally the main Republican alternative to Donald Trump. What do you make of his performance?
He doesn't like people. He has trouble interacting with other humans on the campaign trail. And we kind of saw a little bit of that in the debate. And he also can't find a campaign message. And this is kind of roughly his sixth campaign reboot, and it's going nowhere fast. He just cannot get a footing into why him, and he has been so bad that Republican donors are trying to recruit Glenn Youngkin or Brian Kemp into the primary. So not a good performance.
No, what about, go ahead.
Sorry, I said not as a governor or a candidate, not a good performance.
Okay. What about the former United Nations ambassador Nikki Haley, who was also governor of South Carolina?
I thought she had a good debate. If we were talking about a normal political audience, she held her own. She really made some points about foreign policy, but voters don't really care about foreign policy. Unfortunately, they should. And she's running for president because she, this was kind of always her plan, but she doesn't have a constituency in Trump's party. So I don't see her going anywhere, but I thought she had a good debate as a candidate.
Have any thoughts on the former Vice President, Mike Pence?
He also had a pretty good debate. This is a man, though, who has no spine, and Trump supporters think he's the Antichrist. So he's not going anywhere, no matter how well he does. It was good to hear him finally speak up because it's been a long time since Trump supporters, were planning to hang him at the gallows on January 6th. But again, every one of the candidates who actually had a decent debate is somebody who's never going to win the nomination. And that says a lot about the state of the Republican Party.
What is it? One of the things that mystified me, of course, a lot of things about Republicans mystified me. But, one of the things that was pretty clear to me after the last election, midterms in 2022, was that abortion killed Republican midterm candidates, and they just can't seem to get off that at all.
No, that's absolutely astonishing to me as well, because I was thinking about that. The two issues that voters really came out bipartisan effort in 2022, abortion and election denial. And what did we get from this group of people? Well, as I've already said, I would pretty much count the majority of them as election deniers in some sense, because if they're saying that what
Sarah,
Trump
I'm going to have to interrupt you again to bring back our radio listeners. We'll be right back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and our guest, Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. Welcome back. Our guest in this half hour is Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. We've been talking about the Republican presidential race. and the first Republican National GOP debate last week. By the way, for our radio listeners, if you'd like to watch us as well as listen to us, there are different ways you could do that. You can watch the show as well as listen to it on twitter.com/Brad Bannon or on facebook.com /DC with Brad Bannon /videos. And now back to the Republicans. Sarah, before we took the short break, we were talking about the Republican candidate on abortion. There's a lot of evidence that the Dodd decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, killed probably a great opportunity the Republicans had to take complete control of both houses of Congress, but they couldn't stop talking about it. Since then, states in the Mountain West and the South have been leapfrogging each other to impose new abortion bans, but they can't stop talking about it. Are they just a captive of their base? And do they have any idea how much damage the discussion of abortion is doing to their chances to win the White House and the Senate in 2024?
Well, somebody among them must know, but they don't. It doesn't seem to be trickling up into their actual candidates or whoever's running their campaign policy platforms. But on the other hand, why are they only talking about abortion? It's the only win they've had in a long time, and I think that's why they know they're going. These are people. They've kind of been reduced. They're not leaders anymore. They're people chasing the worship of the base that Donald Trump has. And the only way to chase that is to be in line to get the base to, as you already pointed out, they were booing these candidates when they spoke the truth, and when they said anything intelligent, they got booed. And so what they're doing is they're just catering down, lower and lower and lower to this base to try to get some kind of approval. It's very pathetic. It's not good leadership at all. Kind of would make you question whether they should be in a leadership position. But then I do wonder about the people running the campaigns. They know the numbers. They know why Republicans lost 2022, abortion and election denial. So why are they back at hammering both of those? Because those are the two issues their base love.
Yeah, and I think there's another reason too. As scary as it seems, I think you're going to see the Republicans continue to talk about abortion. I think you're going to see them a lot talk about, criticize the Biden policy on immigration at the Mexican border. I think you're going to see a lot of China bashing. For instance, Nikki Haley is running ads in the early primary states, which accuses of Biden of being soft on China. Tim Scott's running an ad in the early primary states of Iowa and New Hampshire that shows him standing at the Mexican border, pledging to finish the Trump wall, and again accusing the Biden administration of letting drugs come in with the immigrants at the Mexican border. And, one of the reasons why you're going to see them harp on these issues, I think, and I'd like your opinion on this, is because they really can't talk much about the economy anymore. I mean, the reality is the economy under Joe Biden's leadership is getting better. He's created more than 13 million jobs. The economy has created more than 13 million jobs since Joe Biden became president. Inflation is going down. They're going to really harp, I think, on non-economic issues like abortion and immigration in China because they don't have anything else to talk about.
I absolutely agree with that, and I do think we're already seeing them hitting him over the border. And some of what they attack him for has no basis in fact. Today, they've started an investigation into his response to the wildfires in Maui, and I did a call with the White House. They turned that around. They got that approval done in 63 minutes. You're not going to see that. We haven't seen that kind of response. It's just really incredible competence. What are these people? I was asking myself that with every candidate on that stage. Any of these people, are they competent? Will they show up and know how to handle all of these different things that the executive branch needs to handle? Do they know who to ask to even be in their cabinet that's competent? That's a question for Ramaswamy, for example. So I do think that's why they hammer on the easy hits, the culture war, but they also make up things about the economy. They're still going on about that. They find a way, like one little thing that they control to say, this is what we're going to attack over, instead of being a part of a solution for the American people. And one thing we didn't hear a lot of, and we're not going to hear a lot of, which is your point, is actually where they stand on policies. What are they going to do to help people if they want to talk about the economy? What are their plans? Tax cuts for the rich haven't worked for people. Are they going to throw that out again? Because they don't seem to have any other plan. They keep talking about that, doing more of that, opening things up so people don't have to be unionized. These are the kinds of talking points that just simply are landing flat. People know better by now. It's been a long time. I mean, I'm sure there's people who are going to buy it, but it's not something to get independence. And that's where they're really going to get stuck here. All this catering to the base, how are they going to get independence over when the primary's done?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. One of the things that depresses me is, despite all Trump's legal problems and indictments and scheduled trials stacked up, longer than the line of planes at O'Hare Airport, why is Joe Biden? Why did the national polls show Joe Biden and Donald Trump in a close race, basically even?
I mean, my only answer to that is the way the media covers Joe Biden, and the way they're covering this administration, and how difficult it is to get anywhere by being effective and competent and not a drama king. And that's really Joe Biden's problem. He's not a drama king. He's not out creating chaos every day and giving the media something else to talk about. They don't want to talk about policy because people don't read it. So here we are.
Well, here we are. Talk about this more. Sarah, thanks for joining us. Our guest in this half hour was a frequent guest and a friend of the show, Sarah Jones, editor-in-chief of PoliticusUSA.com. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC right after this very short break.
The Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council present the story of Tom and Levi.
Yep, thanks,
Tom is
Sarah.
the smartest man I know. He's been a professor at 2 major universities, been a teacher for over 40 years. One day, he told me that he was having problems in his classes. I think one of the students had asked the question and he didn't remember the answer. And I also noticed that he's letting his class out earlier than they were supposed to let out. And he was telling them that he was doing it as a favor to them, but I think in reality, he just wanted to get out of there. I was really starting to worry because I saw something was wrong.
Levi and I talked about how it would change our lives, but he was there beside me, and my love for him was just immense.
When something feels different, it could be Alzheimer's. Now is the time to talk. Visit alz.org/ourstories to learn more. A message from the Alzheimer's Association and the Ad Council.
What grows in the forest? Trees? Sure. Know what else grows in the forest? Our imagination, our sense of wonder, and our family bonds grow too. Because when we disconnect from this and connect with this, we reconnect with each other and build family memories we will carry with us forever. The forest is closer than you think. Find a forest near you and start exploring at discovertheforest.org. It's easy. Just put in your zip code to find family-friendly outdoor destinations near you. You'll also find guides to free activities, games, and amazing forest facts. Give the magic of the outdoors to your kids and reconnect with your family. Find a forest near you at discovertheforest.org. That's discovertheforest.org. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service and the Ad Council.
Peggy Lee struck a mournful chord with her hit song, Is That All There Is? It was about the vapidity of life, and I found myself subconsciously singing along last week as I pondered the GOP presidential debate. Of course, these made-for-TV spectacles are more akin to mud wrestling than actual policy debates. Still, I dared hope for some tiny element of civic seriousness. After all, the 8 aspirants were auditioning to be, oh say can you see, the next president of the United States. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, for example, stands out as a textbook example of the vapidity of modern American politics. A rampaging ego with no core democratic principles, no authentic persona, no speaking from the heart, and no possibility of being elected, except that special interest powers have pumped him up with $200 million to be their boy. Indeed, a strategy memo from DeSantis' own funders and consultants surfaced publicly just before last week's debate, confirming his vacuity as a candidate and a person. The detailed memo instructed him to avoid talking about policy solutions, to sledgehammer an opponent, to appear both for and against Trump, and maybe to show a little human emotion by talking about his kids. In short, he needs advisors to tell him how to be himself. DeSantis is hardly the first "Who Am I" candidate for the White House. Hillary Clinton's managers reintroduce her as the new real Hillary every couple of months in 2016, and Rick Perry's handlers tried to make him look smart by wearing horn-rimmed glasses. This is Jim Hightower saying this lack of authenticity is now the norm, for it allows big money to shape candidates in its image. And that's why today's public policies are overwhelmingly based on what money wants, not on public need and honest principle.
Welcome back. Brad Van. Our guest in this half hour is Hope Fyre, the founder of Project Lifeline. We're going to talk immigration in this half hour. It's still a sore spot with me. It's one of the issues among many that disturbs me greatly. But before we get to our guest, we're going to play this clip on storms that are gathering in the Caribbean.
It's official. A major hurricane is headed straight for the U.S. Right now, we have 2 huge storms in the Atlantic Ocean. Hurricane Franklin is about to become a Category 4 with 140-mile-per-hour winds. But thankfully, it looks like it's going to stay away from land. However, soon-to-be Hurricane Idalia down here south of Cuba has very different plans. At this moment, this storm is undergoing what we call rapid intensification, and it's happening over these record warm waters between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. And it's going to continue to strengthen as it makes a beeline for western Florida. The official forecast right now is a major Category 3 hurricane making landfall around 8 a.m. Wednesday the 30th, somewhere between Tampa and Apalachicola. But because of these record warm sea surface temperatures, I think it could be even more intense than that. I do expect that there are going to be massive evacuations throughout Florida over the next day or so. So if you live in this area, don't be scared, be prepared, and start making preparations now. There are thousands of scientists, meteorologists, and communicators in the background working diligently to make sure that you have all the information you need.
Okay, that is the latest on the tropical storms coming up through the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean. And you're probably wondering why I'm playing the weather report when today's topic is immigration. Well, to answer that and other questions about the situation at the Mexican border, our guest in this half hour is Hope Fyre, founder and co-executive director of Project Lifeline. Hope, thanks for coming back on the Deadline DC.
Thank you, Brad. I'm always excited to be with you.
Well, we're always excited to have you with us. Now, Hope, maybe you can, you gave me this idea. We chatted before the show, and you said we should talk about climate change. And I thought to myself, why? But then it made a lot of sense to me. What do these storms that are frequently sweeping across the Caribbean have to do with the situation at the Mexican border?
Well, Brad, I'm going to shift this slightly just to talk about kids, because I think when we do the discussion about immigration, we tend to think of it as family units or unaccompanied adults. But one of the groups that's most impacted by the shifting of climate are children. And children on the move is one of the biggest topics that the United Nations has today. There are 2.3 billion children today in the world. Half of those children globally are impacted by climate conditions. So if you think about that, if half of the children in the world are impacted by climate conditions, that's a huge number of people. 9.8 million are weather related, internally displaced people, and 50 million kids are forced to leave their countries. Why are they doing it? Well, conditions, all conditions, but particularly conditions for agriculture and fishing. If you can't eat, you can't stay. In Guatemala, 80% of all indigenous children are malnourished. Why are they malnourished? There's no food.
Okay. Hope, do you think that it, if you're right about that, the problem's going to get worse because the climate is presenting more and more weather disasters all the time. So is this situation just going to keep getting worse?
I think absolutely, Brad. The countries that are most affected, if you look Venezuela and you look at the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, you see the direct impact of continued unusual weather conditions, floods and droughts, and they're not getting better. Climate change is a real thing, and climate conditions continue to worsen. The hurricane story, how many hurricanes have we had this year in the United States alone? So if conditions continue deteriorating, immigration is going to continue increasing. And then you combine that with unstable governments. And the government, you look at Venezuela, for example, the government's been unstable for years. You can't live in Venezuela. So we've seen a huge uptick in Venezuelan migration, and it's connected, weather and governments. And it's not going to end. It's going to get worse.
Okay. Well, let's before we go any further, let me ask you to give us a status update at the Mexican border. Now, this is what I follow from news reports is there's less, there are fewer people coming across the Mexican border than there were. What are conditions like there?
Well, that's a good question. Conditions are flatly horrible. People have been stranded on the Mexican side of the border for months, some for years. Cartel activity has dramatically increased, and that means that people are robbed and raped, children and women are trafficked in increasing numbers. People don't have money, so they don't have food. They don't have places to stay, so they're living on the street. They don't have basic hygiene, so they're getting sick. They don't have money for medical care, so they're dying. And the other thing that's happening is we've got some multi-collaborations going on that are really extraordinarily cruel. And one of them is that the Mexican government is taking people that are along the border or close to the border, people who are coming up, and putting them in buses and taking them deep into the interior of Mexico. Now, Mexico's got a pretty easy to access program. If you're somewhere where there's immigration, you can get a year humanitarian visa here, 1 year only with work permission, but there are no jobs. So people are taken away from the border and put in the middle of nowhere with nothing.
Okay. Let's try, I remember, I think the first time we reached out to you to be on the show several years ago was I was watching these television news reports about children being separated on the border. Is that still happening from their
Well,
families?
that's a great pivot to Operation Lone Star. This is the brazenly cruel practice and policy of Governor Abbott of Texas that he put in place 2 years ago under the emergency disaster legislation for the state of Texas, claiming that people coming across the border constituted a number of emergencies. And what he's done most recently is to string 1,000 feet of 4-foot round buoys across the Rio Grande River outside of Eagle Pass, Texas. These buoys are anchored by, I think, 68 concrete blocks, and then at the bottom there's net. They're so slippery, and they've got wire across the top that you can't get your arms across, so you can't hold the buoy and get on the other side of it. You can't swim under it because there are concrete barriers and nets. And then in the same area, he strung concertina wire. The concertina wire is, extremely, extraordinarily dangerous. So he's put these two inhumane barriers that he thinks will keep people out. Well, one of the things it's done is to push people to other places. And this year, the highest place of immigration is in the Tucson sector. Tucson takes a whole of Arizona. Customs and Border Patrol is broken into 9 sectors, and Eagle Pass is in the Del Rio sector, and then Tucson is in the Arizona sector. 110 degrees every day. It's desert conditions, and they're arresting 3,000 people a day coming across the desert. And that's the other thing. Desert area has increased and temperatures have increased, making the trip more dangerous. You talk about climate. They're finding people dead around Eagle Pass. I think there were 20 bodies found in July, not just the ones we read about in the river. And there are more dying in the desert outside of Tucson. So, you just pivot it to another place and you just kill people differently.
Yeah, this whole situation at the border, I think is just horrifying. Well, let me, the Biden administration, I believe, has filed suit in federal court. Wants the state of Texas and Governor Abbott to take these obstacles out of the Rio Grande, and doesn't the federal government have a legitimate complaint here? The Constitution says that immigration is responsibility of the federal government and the state. Hope, I'm going to ask you to hang on to this question because we got to take a short break for our radio listeners. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon right after these messages, and we won't be going long.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour is Hope Fyre, founder and co-executive director of Project Lifeline. We're talking immigration policy in this half hour. And, this is one of the issues that disturbs me greatly. That's why we've had Hope on several times in the last few years to talk about this problem. It's really so what I consider un-American. As horrifying what's going on the border. I think it undermines our values as, good people. And it really bothers me a lot. Hope, let me ask you this. I saw an ad recently from Tim Scott, one of the Republican presidential candidates, and it's now running in early primary states, including Iowa, New Hampshire, and maybe in his home state of South Carolina, too, because they have an early delegate contest. And it shows Scott at the Mexican border pledging that if he's elected president, he will finish Trump's wall. And then he complains that President Biden is soft on border policy. He's letting immigrants in. He's letting fentanyl in. And I think this is going to be a big issue to Republicans because they're really hitting the culture wars pretty hard. What's your response to the Scott ad?
Well, first of all, this is a really interesting thing that didn't get much play. And that is that Border Patrol has a program where they inspect vehicles going out of the U.S. And the Office of Inspections in the government did a report recently that said there is such a great amount of drugs and guns going into Mexico, and apprehensions when they stop vehicles going into Mexico are so high that this program needs to be expanded. So that's just a kind of a, let's go to the border and talk about what we can do going in the other direction. The Republicans in the debate weren't as cruel as they've been, but they were equally as boneheaded. And I think that the Scott ad, it's again an inflammatory, they want to make just an inflamed emotional appeal about Biden. In point of fact, President Biden has deported 85,000 people. They've been repatriated. That's up 67% more than he did last year. It is significantly more than Trump did in his entire 4 years. And this is just a recent statistic. I think that Biden's policies on the border are dreadful. I think he's keeping people out. He's got a variety of policies that are designed to keep people out, including an increased use of something called credible fear, which is where right when you come in, you get asked questions about your situation in your country. You've just come off the trip. You don't have access.
Okay, Hope, we're going to continue this discussion, but we've got to go to a break to bring back our radio listeners. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC right after this brief break. Welcome back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is Hope Fyre, founder and co-executive director of Project Lifeline. Hope, let me ask you this. What would, in your mind, what would a responsible border policy be?
Brad, if I had the answer to that, I would be all over the place. The border is a huge problem, and it has been a huge problem, not recently. Border Patrol was created in 1920.
Yep. Is there any hope that the federal government, in conjunction with states, will ever, this is just, seems to me there are several problems that the United States is ignoring. Climate change, corruption in government, border policy, which I think is a larger policy about, people uncomfortable with the changes in culture, many of whom seem to be Republicans. Let's say they put you in charge, Hope. What would you like to see happen at the border?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would take proposals by Kids in Need of Defense and the Young Center, which are brilliantly done, about how we receive unaccompanied children. And I would take those and I would put them into play immediately. I would have reception centers for children. I would use the principle, if my child were in that circumstance, had walked 3,000 miles, hadn't eaten, had run from terror, how would I want them to be received? And I would set up reception centers, welcome centers staffed by child welfare professionals. And this is not that heavy of a lift. This is something that we could imagine, and we have lots of people who can help us do this across the professions who would be glad to donate their time. So that's the very first thing I do. Larger border policy, I think, is a much more difficult question, and I don't know what I would do. I know what I wouldn't do. I would never strand people for months and years at a time on the Mexican side of the border. I would never have allowed that problem to develop. I would never have used a specious public health law to keep people out for a year. I can give you a long list of things I wouldn't do. I would honor our international obligations, though, to receive refugees into our country and give them an opportunity under our laws with due process, not with expedited proceedings, to make their case for refugee status, for asylum status. If they can't, then they've got to leave. If they can, under law, they can stay. And we've signed international treaties that obligate us to do this. So first I take care of kids, and then I would never do anything at the border that violated our treaty obligations, our civil rights laws, our human rights laws, international laws on human trafficking, on the treatment of children. We're the only country in the world, Brad, other than Somalia, that hasn't signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. We are one of two, the other being Somalia. I don't know what I'd do exactly, but I know what framework I would use and what I wouldn't do.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I think the Republicans are going to demagogue this issue all through the 24 campaign. It's not as easy for them as it was 2 years ago to attack Joe Biden on economic issues because the economy is getting better. And I think you're going to see more of the culture wars, which means abortion, immigration policy, and it's not going to be pretty. So I guess my question is, you said something about the first thing you said was, I would treat these immigrant children the same way as we do our own children. And my question is, why is that so hard? Immigration's been a great advantage to this country. I speak of someone who both the Bannons came to this country from Ireland in the 1870s. The LeCount side of the family came from Quebec, and they and millions of other immigrants made this a great country. And my question to you is, why is we so hostile to immigrants, especially these immigrants at the Mexican border?
I don't know why we're so hostile. I think, we have had a stir about immigration as long as I can remember. It's not a new issue. What's happened is just what you said. It's been inflated and weaponized to be used as a political issue. Brad, the statistics show that we need the influx of immigrants to keep our workforce healthy. And the Pew Trust and other organizations have testified before Congress on this, and it gets no play at all. So if people are concerned about the economy, then they might look at immigration differently. I think that some of what's at the border is not that hard to fix. And I would go back again to children. Who is it who wants children to be in cages and wants children to be held in baby jails run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement? The shelters, they're called, run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where children go when they're released from the border until they're released to families, are a multi-million dollar for-profit business. So one reason that children grind through the system so slowly is that people are profiting off the backs of kids.
Okay. One of my things is, let me ask you the question directly. How much of this is racism? Uh, you know, they're not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They're brown. How much of this is just a symptom of racism? And there seems to be a lot of it these days in the United States.
Oh, definitely. I mean, racism plays a huge part. Back when we were deporting people, and it's been a while, so I don't remember the statistics, but we were deporting Haitians at a hugely much higher rate than any other nationality group, even though they didn't comprise that big a percentage of people. We did the same things, and we're still doing them to people from Cameroon and people from Mauritania. We don't open the door to the immigration of blacks and certainly browns. I think racism has increased dramatically since Trump became president. We always had racism, but he made it okay to use language, and language is a very important indicator of what we feel. He made it okay to use racist language. He promoted people and groups with racist agendas. So people who sat on the edge of those kinds of things felt emboldened, and they could come out. They outed themselves, and racism is just on a huge rise, and so is anti-Semitism. I mean, I think those two things, racism and anti-Semitism, are always historically linked, and I think we are seeing a rise in both. And yes, the short answer to your question is racism drives a lot of our immigration policy.
The last time we have an economist on the show every once in a while, Dr. Robert Shapiro, and he says that one of the issues in immigration is that the American workforce is depleting. We are going to have record numbers of people on Social Security, according to Dr. Shapiro, but no one to pay into the Social Security system. And so, why can't Americans and Republicans especially see the advantages of immigration rather than it being a big problem?
I think that they just ignore it because it can be a hot button issue. You can make immigration very, very emotional. The economy is really flat. Unless you're troubled by the economy, which many people are, it's just not an issue that provokes rage and the same kind of ire you can get when you point a finger at immigrants. I think that's...
Hope, I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Our guest in this half hour is Hope Fyre, founder and co-executive director of Project Lifeline. I also want to thank Sarah Jones, the editor-in-chief of Politicus.com USA, for joining us to talk about the Republican presidential race, and of course our crackerjack executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. Stand tall and stay strong in these troubled and turbulent times, and look forward to more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can watch on twitter.com/Brad Bannon and on facebook.com Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos.